You know his face before you know a single fact about him. The white suit, the black string tie, the white goatee and the round glasses, and that soft, grandfatherly smile that has sold fried chicken on 6 continents for more than half a century. I grew up seeing that face on a red and white bucket, and like most people, I quietly assumed it was a cartoon, a friendly mascot that somebody dreamed up in a marketing meeting. He was not dreamed up. He was a real man named Harlan Sanders, and the truth about him is far stranger and far darker than any logo could ever be. The man behind that gentle smile carried a pistol. His language could empty a room, even inside a church. And he once ended his own career as a lawyer by brawling with his client in open court. On a spring afternoon in Kentucky, gunfire cracked across a roadside, a man bled out on the pavement, and Harlan Sanders was standing right beside him. All of that came long before the chicken. Here is the part almost nobody tells you. He built exactly one business that truly worked. Then a new highway bypassed his door, the customers vanished, and he sold it at a loss, right around the age most men retire. He was nearly broke when he finally started the thing that made him famous. Then he sold that too, and spent his final years at war with the empire that wore his face. Chapter 1, The Colonel was a costume. Start with the title, because the title was never real. Harlan Sanders was never a soldier, he never wore a real uniform, and he never earned a single day of rank. In 1935, a Kentucky governor named Ruby LaFoon gave him an honorary title called Kentucky Colonel. It meant almost nothing. Governors handed it out like keys to the city, a small piece of folksy thanks, and hundreds of people held one. Most of them framed the certificate and forgot it. Sanders did the opposite. He decided to become the part. First came the little white goatee, then the white suit, worn everywhere, summer and winter, year after year, until nobody could picture him in anything else. He bleached his mustache to match. There was a black string tie, a cane, a pair of round spectacles. He wore the suit to weddings and funerals and breakfast, and even onto airplanes, and by the end he owned almost nothing else. Somewhere in the 1950s, a hard, balding businessman from the rural Midwest quietly vanished, and a Southern gentleman named Colonel Sanders stepped into his place. Here is what most people miss. The costume was a business decision. He had figured out something that most struggling salesmen never do. If you cannot afford to advertise, you become the advertisement. The suit cost him next to nothing, and it walked into every room before he did. It made him look like old money and slow Southern afternoons, like a recipe handed down for generations. The recipe was barely 15 years old. The man wearing it had spent his whole life one bad month from disaster. And almost none of that image was true. The white suit hinted at a plantation and generations of comfortable Southern money. There had never been any such thing. Harlan came off an Indiana farm with a grade school education, and he had invented the entire aristocrat from scratch, right down to the bow tie. It worked better than he could have hoped. By the 1960s, he was a television regular, turning up on game shows, beaming behind the desk while the panel tried to guess who he was. He cut ribbons at restaurant openings and let himself be photographed thousands of times, always in the suit, always with the smile. Eventually, millions of people decided he could not be a real person at all. He was a drawing, a brand, something cooked up to sell dinner. Think about how backward that is. Most people earn their fame, and then the public slowly meets the private person behind it. With Sanders, it ran the other way. The more famous he became, the more completely the real Harlan disappeared, until the character was better known than the man had ever been. The first time that fully landed for me, I understood what he had been selling all along. It was never really the chicken, it was himself. The proof is sitting on his grave right now. His own daughter sculpted a bronze bust of him, finished in 1954. Look at a photograph of Sanders from the year he died, more than a quarter of a century later, and he is almost identical to that bust. The face had stopped aging because it had stopped being a face. It had turned into a logo, and a logo never gets older. But a costume only changes the surface. Put one on a kind man, and you get a kind character. Put one on Harlan Sanders, and you get something far stranger. A kind of double life. Under that white suit was a hard, restless man whose mouth never once matched his smile. The people who worked for him were a little afraid of him. The people who crossed him usually regretted it. The smile was real in the photographs. In person, it was a great deal more complicated. So who was actually under there? To find out, you have to set the bucket down and forget it completely. You have to go back past all of it, past the chicken and the costume, to a time before Harlan had ever set foot in Kentucky. Back to a small farmhouse in Indiana, and a little boy whose world had already begun to fall apart. Chapter 2, 40 Years of Failure. Harlan Sanders was 5 years old the year his father died. The family was living near Henryville, Indiana, with almost nothing put aside, and the loss pushed them to the edge. His mother found work in a cannery to keep food on the table. The job took her away for days at a stretch, which meant the care of 2 younger children landed on the oldest. And the oldest had not yet turned 6. So he learned to cook, because somebody had to. By the age of 7, he could turn out a real meal, bread and vegetables, and whatever meat the children could scrape together. Neighbors were amazed that a boy that small could bake the way he did, but nobody, least of all Harlan, imagined it would ever become a living. For the moment, it was just survival, the one skill that would quietly outlast every disaster ahead of him. And the disasters were already lining up. When his mother remarried, the new household did not seem to have room for him. By most accounts, the boy and his stepfather could not stand each other. So school ended in the 7th grade, and Harlan went off to work on a neighboring farm, the first link in a long chain of jobs he could never quite hold. He swung onto streetcars as a conductor. At 16, he lied about his age and pushed his way into the army, which shipped him to Cuba for a brief and miserable tour before sending him home. Back in the States, he shoveled coal as a railroad fireman, scorching his hands while the trains hauled other men toward better lives. And here his ambition outran his circumstances. By night, through a correspondence course, he studied law. Against every reasonable odd, he passed. For about 3 years, he practiced in Little Rock, Arkansas, a grade school dropout arguing real cases in a real courtroom. For a man the world had written off, it must have felt like vindication. Then he destroyed it in a single afternoon. The story goes that Harlan fell into an argument with his own client right there in the courtroom and finished it the way he finished too many disputes in those years, with his fists. A lawyer who throws punches at the man paying his bill does not stay a lawyer for long, and just like that, the career and the respect that came with it were gone. What came next reads almost like a joke at his expense. He sold insurance until he was fired. A ferry he helped start on the Ohio River actually turned a profit, a small miracle given his record. So he cashed out his share and poured the money into a company that made lamps fueled by acetylene gas. It was a reasonable bet for about a year, right up until electric light swept the country and turned his lamps into scrap. After that, he sold tires, and then he pumped gas at a station the Great Depression quietly strangled. When I lay the whole record out, the thing that stops me is not the bad luck. It is how much of the wreckage he caused himself. By 1930, he was 40 years old. He had tried a dozen trades and lost most of them, and the rare one that worked, he had walked away from at exactly the wrong moment. His temper had cost him paychecks, and his instincts had a habit of backing the wrong idea at the worst possible time. Most men in that spot quietly make peace with a small life. Harlan was not made for a small life. When a chance came to run one more filling station, this time in a rough little Kentucky town called Corbin, he grabbed it. He was middle-aged and nearly out of road, and he had no idea that 2 things were waiting for him on that one stretch of highway: the worst violence he would ever take part in, and the single idea that would finally, after half a lifetime of losing, make him a fortune. Chapter 3. 11 herbs and a pressure cooker. The first customers ate at his own kitchen table. In the back of the Corbin filling station, Sanders kept a small dining area, just room enough for 6. There he fed the travelers who stopped for gas on the road south, cooking everything himself, from country ham and biscuits to the fried chicken people would soon drive out of their way to find. Word spread the way it does in a small place. The chicken at the gas station was worth the stop. By 1937, he had grown the operation into a real restaurant, the Sanders Cafe, with room for roughly 140 diners. The man who had failed at a dozen trades had finally found the one he was built for, and he was good at it. Better than good. His reputation traveled faster than he could have hoped. In 1939, a roving food critic named Duncan Hines listed the Sanders Cafe in his guidebook, Adventures in Good Eating. This was an age before anyone used the word review, and Hines was the closest thing America had to a verdict you could trust. One line from him pointed curious drivers toward a little town most had never meant to visit. Strangers began turning up in Corbin just to taste what the fuss was about. But Harland had a problem that every cook of his day shared. Good fried chicken takes time. Done the old way, in an open pan, it could leave a hungry traveler waiting half an hour, and a customer in a hurry does not wait. He needed speed, without turning the meat to leather. The answer came from an unlikely place. Pressure cookers were becoming a kitchen fad, mostly used for vegetables, and Sanders looked at one and saw something nobody else had. He rigged it to fry chicken under pressure. What had taken half an hour now took under 10 minutes, and the meat came out tender instead of tough. I think this is the most underrated decision in the whole story. Then the place burned to the ground. A fire gutted the cafe in 1939, and a smaller man might have read it as a sign to quit. Sanders read it as a chance to build bigger. The new complex reopened on the 4th of July, 1940, and this time it came with a motel, so a traveler could eat his chicken and sleep under his roof on the same night. In the kitchen of that new cafe, he locked in the other half of the secret. The seasoning. 11 herbs and spices, mixed in proportions he refused to write down for a living soul. He was a perfectionist about that chicken, bordering on a tyrant, and it had to come out exactly right every time. For years he blended the batches with his own hands. Much later, when the company outgrew him, he would split the formula between two separate suppliers, so that no single person could ever hold the whole thing. People have been trying to crack it ever since. And here is the part of him that all those failures had never managed to kill. He was a born salesman. Inside the new cafe, in the hallway between the dining room and the ladies' restroom, he built a complete model of one of the motel rooms. The logic was simple and sharp. A woman could study the bed, the cleanliness, the tidy little furnishings, and decide her family should stay the night. To make certain every guest walked past it, he hung the cafe pay telephone inside that model room. If you wanted to use the phone, you got a good long look at the lodging. It was the kind of trick a modern marketing team would be proud of, dreamed up at a roadside gas station long before anyone gave that thinking a name. It worked. Through the 1940s and into the 50s, Harland Sanders was no longer the man who lost at everything. He had a busy restaurant, a clean motel beside it, and a recipe the whole region whispered about. On the road south, his was the meal travelers planned their day around. He had earned it slowly and the hard way. After everything that had gone wrong before, he had finally built something that held together, and people loved him for it. For a while, in that small Kentucky town, life was good to Harland Sanders. Chapter 4. Gunfire Over a Painted Sign. Rewind a few years back before the cafe was famous, and the same stretch of Corbin Highway looks very different. In those early days it was a hard place. Locals called the strip Hell's Half Acre, and they meant it. Men settled arguments with guns out there. For sport, some of them shot at the billboards along the road, trying to punch bullet holes through the dots over the letters. This is the Corbin where Harland Sanders first hung out his shingle. And I had read about what happened here a dozen times before I understood how badly the popular version gets it wrong. The trouble began, of all things, with a sign. Sanders had painted advertisements pointing travelers toward his station, and a rival operator down the road resented losing the business. The man's name was Matt Stewart, and he ran a competing station a short way off. In those days, before highways carried proper markers, a painted sign on a barn or a wall was how a station pulled cars in off the road. Deface a man's sign, and you were stealing his customers. So whenever Sanders put up a sign, Stewart painted over it. He repainted. Stewart smeared it again. The feud simmered through 1930 and into the spring of 1931, two stubborn, hot-blooded men circling each other over a strip of roadside. Sanders, never one to back down from a fight, warned Stewart plainly. Touch the signs again, and there would be shooting. On the 7th of May, 1931, a boy came running with the news. Stewart was at it again, out there painting over the sign one more time. Sanders was not alone. With him were two men from the Shell Oil Company, Robert Gibson, and a colleague named Shelburne, there on business. All three set off to confront Stewart, and all three were armed. So was Stewart. It was the kind of errand that should have ended in shouting. Instead, it ended in gunfire. What happened next took only seconds. Accounts differ on who drew first, but the gunfire was real, and so was the result. Stewart opened up, and Robert Gibson went down, shot dead on the spot. Sanders reached down and pulled the pistol from the dead man's hand. Then he fired back. A bullet caught Stewart in the shoulder. Shelburne put another into him. He survived, bleeding, and reportedly cried out that Sanders had killed him. He was wrong on both counts. Sanders had not killed anyone, and Stewart was not going to die. Here is where the legend and the truth split apart. You may have seen the claim online that Colonel Sanders once gunned a man down. It is false. He fired in self-defense, with a borrowed gun, at a man who had just committed murder in front of him. The only person who killed anybody that day was Matt Stewart, and the man he killed was Robert Gibson. The myth stuck, because it is the better story. A kindly old chicken salesman with blood on his hands makes a great headline. The truth, that he was a bystander defending himself, does not travel nearly as well. The law saw it the same way. Stewart was convicted of murder and sentenced to 18 years. The charges against Sanders were dropped. He had defended himself and walked free, and the killing barely touched his name. A local paper even botched the spelling when it ran the story, which did him no harm at all. It is a strange thing to sit with. A man could trade gunfire over a corpse in 1931, and 30 years later, become the friendliest face in America. Same man, same hands. Matt Stewart never served his full sentence. In 1933, out pending an appeal, he was shot and killed by a deputy who had come to arrest one of his workers. The details were murky, and people whispered that Gibson's family had paid to have it done. Whether that was true, no one ever proved. A violent end, fitting for everything that came before it. And yet, for all the blood on that roadside, the gunfight was not the deepest wound Harlan Sanders would carry. The worst was still a year away. It would not come from a stranger with a gun. It would come from inside his own home. Chapter 5. The Family He Could Not Keep. The next blow came in 1932, the year after the gunfight, and it arrived without a sound. There was no rival this time, and no gun, just a routine illness in a young man's throat. Harlan and his wife Josephine had 3 children, 2 daughters, Margaret and Mildred, and 1 son, Harlan Jr. The boy was 20 years old, full of promise, and by every account his father's pride. Then his tonsils became infected. In that era, before antibiotics, a throat infection could turn deadly, and this one did. Harlan David Jr. died from the complications. There was no enemy to confront, and no sign to repaint. For once, there was nothing for a fighting man to do but grieve. It broke something in Sanders that the failures and the gunfire never had. By one biographer's account, he sank for a time into a deep depression. The man whose face would one day beam from 1,000 chicken buckets carried a private grief the cameras would never catch. For a man who measured himself by what he could build and provide, a child he could not save may have been the one failure he could never explain away. He had buried his only son. That is the fact I keep setting next to the smiling logo, because the two of them do not fit. His marriage had been quietly failing for years before that. Harlan married Josephine back in 1909 when he was a young railroad worker in Alabama. She had married a man with big talk and then watched him fail at trade after trade. She stood by him through all of it, every lost job and broken venture, every move to another town with nothing waiting at the end. The marriage survived poverty. It could not survive everything else. At one low point, Josephine took the children and went home to her parents, unable to lean on a husband who could not stay employed. By the time the Corbin restaurant began to succeed, the marriage was a shell, and into that shell walked a younger woman named Claudia. Claudia Leddington was divorced, and she worked at the restaurant. Sanders fell for her hard while he was still married to Josephine. The arrangement was unusual, to put it gently. By one account, Josephine herself hired Claudia, at Harlan's suggestion, which put the wife and the mistress under the same roof. It is not a flattering chapter of his life, and his biographers have never pretended otherwise. By all accounts, she was devoted to him, and she would stay at his side for the rest of his life. However it came about, Sanders had made his choice long before he was free to act on it. The reckoning finally came in 1947. After nearly 4 decades of marriage, Harlan and Josephine divorced. It was the close of a marriage that had outlasted his every failure, undone at last not by poverty, but by his own heart. 2 years later, in 1949, he married Claudia, the woman he had wanted all along. He was almost 60 years old. So here is the strange shape of Harlan Sanders by the end of the 1940s. He could make a tired stranger at his counter feel like family. His only son was in the ground. The first marriage had collapsed under the weight of his restlessness. The warmth that the world would soon fall in love with was, at home, a far harder and lonelier thing. He would go on to feed millions of families, and he never managed to hold his own together. He had Claudia now, and a restaurant that worked, and for a moment it must have looked like solid ground. It was not. The very road that had carried all those travelers to his door was about to be moved, and when it moved, it would take everything with it. Chapter 6. Broke at 65. Progress came for Harlan Sanders in the shape of a new highway. In the middle of the 1950s, the country began building its interstate system, and the new route through Kentucky was laid to run wide of Corbin. The traffic that had fed his cafe for a quarter century was about to be sent somewhere else entirely. It happened the way these things happen, slowly and then all at once. The cars thinned. The dining room emptied. A business that had once drawn unsolicited offers now sat on a road to nowhere. For a man who had finally tasted success, watching it drain away car by car must have been a special kind of cruelty. When Sanders put the place up for sale, the buyers who had once come knocking had vanished. He sold it at auction in 1956, reportedly for around $75,000. That was far less than it had been worth, and a fraction of what he had turned down only a few years earlier. Take a moment with where that left him. He was 65 years old. The one thing he had ever built that worked was gone, sold off at a loss, and he was nearly broke. By most accounts, he was leaning on a Social Security check of a little over $100 a month, with only a trickle of other income coming in. He had spent his whole life losing, and now, at an age when other men were easing into a porch chair, he had lost the only thing he had ever won. Most people would have stopped there. He had every excuse to. But Sanders held one card that the world did not know about yet. Years earlier, in 1952, he had driven out to Utah and cooked his chicken for a restaurant owner named Pete Harmon. Harmon tasted it and put it on his menu. His sales climbed and then tripled. It was Harmon's Place, in South Salt Lake, that became the first true Kentucky Fried Chicken. The name itself was born there, dreamed up to set the dish apart. So when Sanders lost Corbin, he was not actually starting from nothing. He had proof, sitting in Utah, that his recipe could sell anywhere. There is a particular nerve in what he did next, and I doubt I would have found it at his age. The broke old man did the only thing left to him. He hit the road. Into the trunk of a white Cadillac went his pressure cookers and packets of secret seasoning. Out he went, town to town, restaurant to restaurant, cooking samples in other men's kitchens. He was in his mid-60s and traveling on a shoestring, by some accounts sleeping in the car to stretch his money. The strangers he cooked for often had no idea who he was. The pitch was simple. Let me show you. He would fry a batch right there, and if the owner liked it, they shook hands on it. Sanders got a nickel for every chicken the restaurant sold. You have probably heard that he was turned down 1,000 times before anyone said yes. The famous figure is 1,009 rejections. That number is folklore. It gets repeated everywhere and traced to nowhere. But the truth underneath it holds. He heard no a great many times. An old man in a white suit asking busy owners to change the way they cooked got sent on his way more often than not. Then the yeses started to come. One restaurant, then another. Soon a handful had signed on. Each new franchise made the next one easier to sell. A recipe doing well in one town was an argument he could carry to the next. The nickels added up. By the late 1950s, the thing was no longer a hope. It was a business, growing on its own momentum, spreading across the country one fryer at a time. And there it is, the turn that took half a lifetime to arrive. Every failure that came before had been an apprenticeship he never knew he was serving. The years of losing had made him a salesman and a survivor, and the cafe had made him a cook. At 65 broke, he finally had a product worth pouring all of it into. The man who could not hold a job had become a man with an idea the whole country wanted, and the money that was about to follow would be stranger than anything he had ever imagined. Chapter 7. $2 million in a plastic cage. A nickel is nothing until you are collecting it on millions of chickens. That was the math no one had seen coming. By the early 1960s, the franchises Sanders had signed on handshakes had multiplied into roughly 600 outlets across the United States and Canada. By some accounts, it was the largest fast food operation in the country. The broke old man from Corbin was now sitting on top of an industry he had more or less invented. There was just one problem. The business had grown far bigger than one man with a car trunk full of pressure cookers could possibly run. Sanders was past 70. He was buried in paperwork, chasing nickels from hundreds of operators scattered across the map. By his partner's own telling, he was overwhelmed and more than a little bored. He had spent his whole life trying to build something that would last, and now that he finally had, it had outgrown what his own two hands could manage. So in 1964, he let it go. Two younger men, a Kentucky lawyer named John Y. Brown Jr., and a Nashville financier named Jack Massey, made him an offer. The deal came together quickly, written out on a yellow legal pad in a hotel room. It was signed only after Pete Harmon, the man who had opened that first Utah store, gave it his blessing. The price was $2 million in cash. For a man who had been nearly destitute less than a decade earlier, leaning on a small monthly pension check, that was an enormous sum of money. And Sanders, never one to be quiet about a win, made sure people saw it. What happened next belongs in the history of publicity stunts. By his partner's account, Sanders went on Johnny Carson's show and had $2 million in cash wheeled out onto the stage. It sat there inside a clear plastic cage with security guards standing watch beside it. Picture it. An old man in a white suit, who a few years earlier had been frying samples in strangers' kitchens, now grinned beside a literal cage of money on television. Every time the Colonel went on a show like that, franchise sales jumped, and his partners marveled at his instinct for the spotlight. But here is where the story turns bittersweet, because Sanders gave away two things in that deal that he would spend the rest of his life regretting. The first was the upside. Brown and Massey tried to get him to take part of his payment in company stock. Sanders refused. He thought the stock would end up worthless without him at the helm. The idea that the company might do better in other hands was something he simply could not accept. So he took the cash and walked away from the equity. Within 7 years, those two men sold Kentucky Fried Chicken to a larger company for around $285 million. The fortune he had built ballooned to more than 100 times what he sold it for, and almost none of that went to him. The second thing he gave away was stranger, and it cuts to the heart of who he was. Written into the contract was the sale of his likeness. He sold them his face. The character he had so carefully built, white suit and goatee and all, now belonged to a corporation. The company could slap the colonel on a bucket or turn him into a cartoon, and there was nothing the actual colonel could do about it. Of all the things in this story, the sale of his own face is the one that unsettles me. For years he had built a character out of nothing, and then he sold the rights to it along with the recipe. By the terms of his own contract, he was now an employee, paid a salary for life to go on being himself in public. $2 million in a cage. It made a great picture. But the smiling man beside it had just locked something away that no amount of cash could buy back, and he did not fully understand that yet. The house he was about to buy with his fortune would give him room to figure it out. Chapter 8. The Empire Run from a Haunted House. So where does a man go to enjoy a fortune like that? In Sanders' case, the answer was a house that came with a ghost story attached. It was an odd choice of home for a wealthy man, and it suited him perfectly. The place was called Blackwood Hall, an old home set in the countryside outside Shelbyville, Kentucky. It had been built back in 1866, and it carried a name borrowed straight from a Nancy Drew mystery. The previous owner's daughters had named it after a 1948 book called The Ghost of Blackwood Hall. When Sanders bought the property, he liked the eerie name enough to keep it and put up a sign. Over the years, a few vague rumors of an actual haunting drifted around the house, though no one ever produced real evidence. The ghost, it turned out, was mostly literary. For a man who had spent his life building a myth, a home with its own ghost legend was an oddly fitting address. But here is the part that fits him perfectly. Sanders had not bought Blackwood Hall as a rich man's retirement toy. He had moved there years before the big payday. It was 1959. The collapse in Corbin had just pushed him out, and at 69 he needed a new base. From that strange old house, with its borrowed ghost and its 1860s bones, he ran the entire franchising operation through the years it exploded. Staff and paperwork filled the rooms, and the old place became the company's first real headquarters. A fast food empire, in other words, was being run out of a Kentucky house, named after a haunted hall. It was not a palace. At roughly 5,000 square feet, it would have fit inside the ballroom of some of the mansions we usually explore, but it was his, and it remained the Sanders home for the next quarter century. For a man who could now have afforded almost any house in Kentucky, this old place was apparently all he wanted. What he did with his money is its own kind of surprise. Sanders gave a great deal of it away. He had attended church for years and tithed faithfully. The giving was not for show. It came out of a faith he took seriously. Large sums went to children's hospitals and college scholarships, funneled through trusts that still hand out money today. Much of that giving flowed north into Canada, where he kept a second home and a deep loyalty. A children's hospital wing near Toronto still carries his name. He used to say there was no sense being the richest man in the graveyard, since a corpse cannot do any business down there. And yet the man was not at peace. I find this quieter than the gunfight, and somehow sadder. By his own admission, late in life, all the success and all the charity had never settled his account with God. What gnawed at him was the very thing that had defined him from the start, his temper and his hard, profane tongue. He had given himself over to his faith and still could not forgive his own mouth. A church-going man in his 80s, lying awake over the anger that had trailed him since boyhood. There was only one thing that had ever quieted the restlessness in him. He kept working. Most men in their 70s, sitting on millions, would have eased into the porch chair he had earned. Sanders climbed back into a car instead. Well into his 80s, he was still on the road as the company's public face. He kept a schedule that would have flattened men half his age, always in the white suit. Stopping was not in him. The rumors had the haunting backwards. Whatever unease hung over Blackwood Hall came from the living man pacing inside it. He was rich beyond his wildest dreams, and still he could not find peace. Very soon, all that restless energy would find a target. He was about to go to war with the company that now owned his name. Chapter 9. At War with His Own Name. By the late 1970s, the famous old man on the bucket had taken up an unusual hobby. He went around telling people that the food was terrible. This was not a private grumble. Sanders was still the official salaried face of Kentucky Fried Chicken, the smiling figure in the advertising, and he used that platform to publicly savage the company's cooking. The decline in quality after he left ate at him. In his eyes, the people now running his life's work were cutting corners and selling slop under his name. He was, in a strange way, advertising food he could not stomach. His favorite target was the gravy. In one newspaper interview, he said it had become nothing but wallpaper paste. And he would know, he added, because he had watched his own mother make the paste when he was a boy. The mashed potatoes he wrote off as sludge. He insisted the gravy had no food value at all, and that the company had no business putting it on a menu. This was the founder, talking about his own restaurant in print. The company tried to take it in stride. Their position, more or less, was that the old man was a purist whose standards had been fine when he ran a handful of stores. Running a chain of thousands was a different problem, and they needed room to feed the real world. By then, the chain had grown past 5,000 restaurants, and the man who had once cooked every early batch himself could not police a single one of them. There was some truth in their side of it. The very pressure cooking shortcut that had made him famous had started out as a compromise for speed. But Sanders was not interested in their parameters. He wanted the food made his way, and it was not being made his way anymore. He did not limit the war to interviews. The Colonel was feared across the franchise system for his surprise visits. He would turn up at a Kentucky Fried Chicken unannounced and, if the food fell short, let the staff have it. Stories had him tasting a bad batch and tossing it aside in disgust. Owners learned to dread the sight of the white suit coming through the door. Then comes the part that turns the whole thing tragic. And what gets to me is not the anger. It is the helplessness underneath. Back in 1968, Sanders and Claudia had opened a restaurant of their own near Blackwood Hall. It was a sit-down place serving the kind of cooking he believed in. He wanted to name it after Claudia, the Colonel's lady. But there was a problem he had created himself. He no longer owned the rights to the name Colonel, not for selling food. He had signed those away, along with his face, back in 1964. The company held the title he had built up over decades, and they were not about to let a competitor use it. So the lawsuits began. By the early 1970s, the company had changed hands again, sold to a corporation called Heublein, and Sanders went after them in court. He sued for the misuse of his image, furious that his face was being slapped on products he had never created. The figure he demanded was huge, around $122 million. From the other direction, a frustrated franchise owner sued him for libel over the wallpaper paste remarks. That case was thrown out, with the court ruling he had insulted the company at large rather than any single store. The image suit ended the way these things usually do, in a settlement. Sanders walked away with roughly $1 million, a fraction of what he had asked, and his own restaurant had to give up the fight over the title. It was renamed for Claudia alone, the Claudia Sanders Dinner House. The Colonel quietly stripped from the sign. Here is the cruel shape of it. Harlan Sanders gave the last decade of his life to a war over the quality of a name he no longer owned. He had built the Colonel out of nothing and sold him to strangers for cash. Then he watched, unable to stop it, as those strangers did whatever they liked with the character. It was a fight he could never win, because he had signed away the only ground he could have stood on. He was an old man shouting at his own reflection, and the time he had left to shout was running short. Chapter 10. The Mask Outlived the Man. The restless old man finally came to a stop in the winter of 1980. That June, doctors had found acute leukemia. He passed his final months in a hospital bed, his body failing even as his arteries, by one account, stayed those of a much younger man. By December the 16th, with pneumonia setting in, Harlan Sanders was gone, at the age of 90. Kentucky sent him off like a head of state. His body lay in state in the rotunda of the state capitol. It was an honor reserved for governors and war heroes, granted here to a man who had once sold fried chicken from a roadside table. The funeral filled a chapel at the Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville. More than 1,000 mourners came. Outside, a Boy Scout honor guard stood coatless in 10-degree cold. The ushers were all Kentucky Fried Chicken employees, wearing the same black string tie the Colonel had made famous. At his own request, the singer Pat Boone performed a hymn called "He Touched Me." For a poor boy from Indiana who had failed at a dozen trades, it was an astonishing send-off. They buried him in the white suit. He had chosen the plot years earlier, at Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville. It is a green and historic place, where a famous explorer and thousands of Civil War dead already rested. In time, his grave became the most visited in the cemetery. The staff eventually painted a yellow line along the cemetery road to guide the steady stream of visitors straight to him. The marker is a ring of 4 columns around a bronze bust, sculpted by his daughter Margaret. Claudia would join him there years later, and to this day people leave odd little tributes on the grave, chicken buckets and ketchup packets. There is something almost comic in it, and something tender too, fans bringing fried chicken to a dead man. That should be the end of the story. A long life, a hard road, a peaceful grave. But it is not the end, because the man died and the Colonel did not. This is the part that gives the whole story its strange final shape. The character Sanders had built in the 1950s, the white suit and the unhurried Kentucky drawl, did not go into the ground with him. The company that owned it kept it working. They hired voice actors to be him. A cartoon version of him appeared, selling chicken on television. The Colonel went right on smiling and selling, in commercials the actual Colonel never saw and probably would have hated. At the time of his death, the chain had reached more than 6,000 outlets in dozens of countries. Decades later, that smiling face still sells chicken on buckets and signs in countries Sanders never set foot in. The man who built the Colonel as a cheap way to stand out had created something that would outlast him by generations. So this is where it all lands. Harlan Sanders, the man, lies under 4 columns in a Kentucky cemetery, found by following a painted yellow line. Colonel Sanders, the mask, is immortal. He sells chicken on 6 continents, ageless and tireless, a cartoon now, fully detached from the troubled human who invented him. The costume has comfortably outlived the man who wore it. And that is worth sitting with, the next time you pass one of those red and white buckets with the smiling face on the lid. That face is not really Harlan Sanders. It never quite was. The real man failed at everything he touched for 40 years. He survived a deadly gunfight over a painted sign, and later buried his only son. His first marriage fell apart. He went broke at 65 and clawed his way back from nothing. And his final years became a war with the very name now grinning out at you from the bucket. The cartoon will never tell you any of that. But now you know. Personally, I will take the messy human story under the white suit over the tidy cartoon any day.